Everyone's got a podcast, it feels like. But you still, the average person still only listens to famous people on their podcasts.
Sure, but I think it's really interesting when you start to think about like everyone having an outlet, right?
Yes.
Everyone
Yeah.
has an outlet. So even if I don't have, or, we don't have a big viewership for our podcast, if I have something I want to say, right? Or if I have an opinion about something, or if I have a direction I want to go with something, podcast is a way for us to kind of get that message out on an independent platform. And the independence is what's interesting to me about podcasts. What's very interesting is that there's no media corporation, there's no Fox or CNN or any of these guys who is taking over the management or control of the podcast. And you've got certain ones that are, a network. You've got, I don't know, what's the
iHeartMedia,
Daily Wire or any of that stuff.
But you do have ultimate corporation control, Apple, Amazon, Spotify.
Of the distribution.
But
not the content.
But not the content,
And
right.
that's interesting.
But they will eventually control the content
Right.
if they want to. If you say the wrong thing enough, they'll shut it down.
They could limit it. Well, and I think a certain bit of like, okay, but they could. But what ends up happening is you end up getting an outlet like, let's say, YouTube has been very kind of loose with that kind of stuff. Like you can pretty much have a podcast about just about anything on YouTube. There have been times where they've deemed it to be dangerous for the public good or whatever it is.
Yeah,
and that stuff doesn't happen quite as much, in 2024 as it did. But it's not like something like a CNN or NBC News where you've got a very thin margin for what you can do and say, in those scenarios. You have a very thin element on a network show where you can go into topics that are on the verge or controversial. You have very, you can't see, what's the guy's name? Brian, what's the guy's name on NBC News? I don't remember anymore. It's been so long since I watched it. You can't see a network anchor going into how they feel, Brian Williams, how they feel about their opinion about something. You can't see that happening. And I think that's why certain podcasts have gotten to be, more influential than others and things like that. But I think the democratization of the information is what's fascinating. And you see people like Shannon Sharp, who is just becoming sort of a force in that world, because he can have somebody like Cat Williams come on his podcast and talk for 3 hours. He says a bunch of crazy stuff about the entertainment business, and it becomes news. The other thing I think is interesting, I haven't ever seen any whole podcast. All I've ever done is watched little clips on YouTube Shorts or on TikTok or whatever. And I'll listen to them occasionally, but I won't ever watch a whole episode.
Yeah. I think the people who consume an entire podcast are the people who are actually listening to it.
Yeah.
Right? Because with the way technology works, the way we have the ability to have professional microphones, professional lighting, professional cameras, why wouldn't you film it? If you're sitting down, you're having the whole production, you're recording this, why wouldn't you film it too? Because we all tend to be more visually stimulated than audible stimulated. But if a lot of podcasts are consumed rather than radio, you're driving in your car, you're listening to a podcast. Passively listening to a podcast. Those are the podcasts that are getting, you're listening to it from beginning to end. Right. And it could be 15 minutes, it could be an hour, it could be 3 hours. But you're taking it in passively. The question that I keep coming back to is, what are the ingredients to make a great podcast if you're not famous already? Shannon Sharp is famous already. He's a Hall of Fame football player. He's been on television after his career was over for a decade.
But in his podcast, he's not talking about sports.
It doesn't matter.
Right.
He's famous already, and he's got famous friends he's bringing on. He's not talking to Joe the plumber.
Right.
He's talking to professionals, famous people. But the formula that I want to crack is, how do you become influential if you're not already influential?
Yeah. So you have to have the personality. So that's number one. You have to have kind of either a polarizing personality. You have to be sort of like overly energetic, or have, if you look at somebody that's an unlikely influential person, like a Ben Shapiro, right? Not likable, not like a person who's sort of somebody that people instantly like, but he's got such an amount of energy, talks so fast, he's got such rooted beliefs that he polarizes people.
Mm-hmm.
And what I love about somebody like, let's say, Jon Stewart is a great comedian. He's polarizing. And now, Jon Stewart is not famous for his podcast. He's still on a relatively traditional TV show. But if Jon Stewart decided tomorrow, I don't want to deal with Apple anymore, I just want to do my podcast, he would have nobody to stand in his way of becoming one of the biggest podcasts in the world. And but Jon Stewart is a guy that has very strong opinions about things. He kind of moves in his own way, and he's polarizing. So you probably have an opinion about something you've seen in a clip
Sure.
from Jon Stewart. And the same thing about Ben Shapiro, same thing about Charlie Kirk, same thing about The View, or any of these people who get on and do that stuff. And I think someone being polarizing is a big element to it. And I don't think that's the only way, but I think that's one. So what ends up happening in a marketing context is, if we're thinking about our clients, right? The last thing I want one of my clients to do is to be polarizing.
Well,
right? I don't want them to go out
crank
and
up the PR division.
yeah, that's right. Once we start doing PR, but the last thing I want one of my clients to do is to get out and say something that's controversial, something that's polarizing. And so, it's an interesting thing. I think regular people can be engaging if they talk about engaging subjects that other people are interested in. So, our client, Limitless Fishing, right? So we got Josh on a podcast, and Josh was talking about fishing to a professional fisherman, or to somebody that did this, full time or whatever. And they're talking the deep kind of, deep details of fishing, right? The stuff that I wouldn't understand and you wouldn't understand. But if somebody loves fishing, they would listen to that. And Josh isn't famous, and the people that he's talking to are not necessarily famous, but they could be influential enough in their space to make it worth their while, And I think that could be just about anything. I know Zach that works with us and Ryan could sit in here and talk about Dungeons and Dragons for an hour and a half, right? And Dungeons and Dragons people would love it, right? They don't have to be famous. They're just creating a conversation around Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that's where people can really do some cool stuff from a small standpoint, because we don't need 1 billion viewers or listeners to what we do to make it worth what we're putting into it.
Well, that's where the ROI comes into play.
Right.
Like, at what point is the effort worth it?
Right.
Now, clients or us or whoever, if you're taking the approach of, I'm using this opportunity to put my voice out there, to say something because I have an opinion on something, and I don't care what people think, I don't care how many followers I have, I just need to get it out, right? That's one element of it. Right. Then it becomes a passion. You can sit here and talk about whatever you want for as long as you want, right. And maybe something's important, maybe it's not. If you have a specific thing that you want to get across, a specific message that you want to get out, then once you say it and publish it, then you have to figure out how to put it in front of strategically put it in front of people's eyeballs to let it grow. And certainly niche topics have an audience, but there's a lot of that's the balance of, okay, am I trying to make money on the podcast, or am I just trying to get awareness to make money from what I really do?
Well, and there's so many examples of people who have, let's say they've been successful in one area, and then they decide to become their own media company and start a podcast or start a, the way that has worked. Impact Theory is one that I listen to a lot, right? Tom Bilyeu, awesome podcast because he has the craziest guests on there, like physicists and people that like talk about mindset and talk about psychological things. And I mean, talk about fitness, and they talk about marriage, and there's no real topic. It's just like whatever Tom's interested in is what he has on his podcast. And I think he's been somebody who's come from absolutely nowhere, right? He invented a protein bar or developed a protein bar, became rich from that, put all his money into, starting a podcast. Those are ones that I've listened to all the way through. I'll listen to a 2-hour podcast. I find those so interesting. But with, with the video versions of it, I watch 10, 15 minutes and then I have a hard time focusing on that. But I will watch clips of a podcast infinitely. And I think it is so interesting that, for instance, I've never seen a whole Joe Rogan podcast, but I see the clips. I see every time he has a new guest, every time Shannon Sharp has a new guest, I don't see the whole podcast. I see clips. I see those little moments. And I think that's, especially in this world of having to create so much attention and so much, garner so much attention. I think that podcast elements are something that usually gets a pretty good bit of attention, even if your podcast doesn't have a lot of viewers, even if you don't have a lot of followers. Your clips can get attention because it looks like what people are doing, and it looks like a podcast, and it looks like the right thing. Sure. And I think it's really interesting. You got to have something good to say. You got to have something interesting for people to get. And if you can give value on your podcast, then all the better. But I think the only reason to record a 20 or 30 minute or 1 hour podcast is to take that and separate it into 15 clips that you can put onto social.
Well, you can also think about the oddity of watching two people talk and have a conversation.
Right.
Like, it wasn't until really it was Howard Stern was the first one to record his radio show.
Right.
And you would sit there and you would watch it.
Yeah.
And see what's happening behind the scenes, and seeing someone sit in a chair in front of a microphone and just talk.
Yeah. It is interesting.
He was the first one to do it. And now, why wouldn't you do it if you're going to record it anyway? It's like but then there's also like vlogs, right? Which are different than a podcast, or they're just basically solo podcasts.
Yeah. I mean, there's all
the
kinds
radio
of ways to do it.
version of the podcast where you're actually talking to somebody, you're having a conversation.
Yeah.
There's also news. Like some podcasts are dedicated to regurgitating news from other sources, and because they're not real journalists.
Well, and the thing is, we're excited about like being able to kind of. I love the idea of being able to get into the client's real story. We're going to have a couple over the next couple weeks come into the studio and do podcast here, and I think it's really interesting to kind of listen to the conversation, and we get interested in their conversation, even if we don't really know what their business is. We have an orthopedic practice that's coming in next week to talk about not orthopedic. We have an orthodontic practice that's coming in next week to talk about orthodontics, right?
Yeah.
It's not a thing I'm interested in. You might be interested in it coming soon because you got kids that age. But, I think it's going to be interesting just to hear them talk about their business and all of the things that are kind of universal about what they do. And so I think it's the other thing I think is very interesting is that the media companies have got to be terrified of this landscape because I heard somebody talk about on a podcast a couple weeks ago the fact that Netflix will spend, $500 million for a series on Netflix, but Joe Rogan can do 3 hours of content for no money, and draw as many or more viewers on YouTube than Netflix does on their $300 million series.
Right.
And I think that is a legitimate threat to modern media, is just how easy it is for people who have something interesting to say or a perspective or any of those things to be on a podcast. I think Joe Rogan's interesting because he doesn't seem to have much of a perspective. So all he really is a sounding board for whoever his guest is. So I think it's kind of interesting to watch, those different personalities work like that.